morning's story is Cinderella for Rosemary. Now, Cinderella is a very old story, and it appears across the world in all sorts of different guises, but the version we all know and love is a French story from the 18th century. Cinderella wasn't born with that name. Her name was Eleanor, or Ella for short. Her father was a rich nobleman, and her mother was a loving, kind, sweet mamma. Ella was very, very happy, until one day her lovely mother fell ill and died. Ella's father was heartbroken, as was Ella, and they soon fell under the scheming clutches of a local widow, also a noblewoman but penniless. And she thought, if I can worm my way into that household and marry them, then I shall be rich. All I have to do is pretend I love them. And so that's what this woman did. And very soon Ella's father was marrying again, thinking he'd got a lovely, kind new mamma for Ella. But very quickly things turned around. The widow, now the mother, showed her true colours very quickly. She brought with her 2 daughters as scheming and as nasty as herself. The girls did not get on, so they started bullying her and teasing her and making them do their jobs. Their mother, Ella's stepmother, was worse. She told lies to Ella's father and said that she had been stealing stuff and misbehaving and telling lies. And Ella's father, who was completely under the spell of this woman, believed her. And so Ella lost her beautiful bedroom, which was given to the widow's own daughters, and Ella was sent up to an attic bedroom, cold and draughty. Ella slowly was reduced to a servant. Not only did she have to clean her sister's rooms, but as time went, she found that she had to get up at 5 in the morning, clean all the ashes out of all the grates, relay the fires. And then after a breakfast of bread with no honey, she then had to go round the house and polish all the wooden furniture and dust. And after lunch, which was soup made out of vegetable peelings, she then had to go and help her sisters with their needlework and their homework, because although she was considered to be nothing more than a servant, her sisters and her stepmother did agree that she had excellent taste and was a superb needlewoman. So the afternoons, although the work might seem less arduous, were actually worse, for she had to sit in the company of her stepmother and her sisters. Over the years, Ella grew to be a beauty, but the family forgot her name was Ella, for she was so exhausted that often in the evening she would fall asleep by the kitchen fire in the ashes, and then when she came to work in the morning, for she wouldn't have time to wash, she would be covered with ashes and cinders and smuts, and her mother and sisters called her Cinders, or Cinderella, and her beauty shone even behind the ashes and the dirt. When she was about 18, and the sisters, being a little older, were thinking of getting married, there were suitors aplenty to the house, but none of them even stopped to look at Cinderella, because, well, she must be the maid, mustn't she? And then one day, an amazing thing happened. An invitation came from the palace that all nobles, their sons and daughters, were to attend the prince's 21st birthday ball. There were to be 2 nights of festivities, and everybody was invited to both. Well, the girls were over the moon, and they immediately dragged Cinderella upstairs to discuss dresses and patterns and embroidery and hairstyles. For as I've said, although they despised the girl, she did have superb taste. And so, for a while, Cinderella was taken off household tasks and set to sewing and embroidering. And then the hatter came to make beautiful fascinators to put in the girls' hairs. The jewellers came, and Cinderella helped pick out the best necklaces for both girls. Necklaces, rings, earrings were bought. Money was no object, for their father believed absolutely everything his new wife said, that the girls simply had to have new everything for both nights of the ball. The day drew closer. The clothes were almost ready, they were hanging up, and there was even a spare dress apiece in case anything went wrong or the girls changed their minds. Cinderella looked at the gowns and touched the embroidery and the jewels and the velvet and the silks and thought, I'd love to wear something like that. And then she sighed and went back to her work. On the day of the ball, the girls demanded that Cinderella help them with their hairdos and help them dress. And in those days, girls wore corsets, tight bindings around their middles, and they had to have laces in, like shoelaces. And this is absolutely true, the only way to do it up was if somebody put their knee in the middle of your back and pulled and pulled and pulled. And no, you couldn't breathe. A lot of girls fainted. But these sisters, they wanted their corsets so tight they would look as tiny and as waist-thin as a wasp. They broke several pairs of corset laces each before they were happy, and then the makeup went on. In those days, it was fashionable for women to have almost white faces and red lips like gashes and black eyes like holes. And they used to wear different shaped black patches on their faces. They were called beauty patches. Well, Cinderella thought they looked awful with all this makeup, but that's what they wanted. Now, many people think that Cinderella's stepsisters were ugly. Well, they weren't really ugly. It was just they always scowled or looked cross, which meant their faces were always, wrinkles in their brows and that doesn't look very beautiful, does it? And so it wasn't really that they were ugly. It was their inside ugliness that showed on their faces. And so however much makeup they put on, they would never be beautiful, Cinderella thought sadly. Well, she waved them off to the ball, and they went in their father's carriage, looking very grand indeed. And Cinderella sat by the fire and cried. If you'd asked her why she was crying, she'd have said, maybe it's relief they've gone, or maybe she was a little bit sad at being treated so badly and not being allowed to go. Who knew? But then suddenly there was a knock at the door. She went and opened it, and outside stood a very grand lady indeed. Cinderella just stood and gawped, and the woman said, aren't you going to invite me in? Cinderella stepped back and curtsied and said, yes, Mum, but usually visitors come to the main front door, not the kitchen door. Well, said the woman, shedding her cloak onto a chair, I'm not just any visitor. I am your fairy godmother. Fairy godmother, said Cinderella. Yes, she said, I was your mother's best friend, and I am your godmother, and I am a fairy. Why have I never heard of you? Said Cinderella. The fairy shrugged. I believe your mother died when you were quite young. I was on the other side of the world, doing magic for other people. I only arrived back last night and discovered that my dear friend had died years ago. So I'm sorry I haven't been here before, but now I have come and I will help you achieve your dreams. Cinderella's mouth dropped open and said, would you like a cup of tea, fairy godmother? And so the godmother and Cinderella sat at the kitchen table drinking tea and eating cake. Well, the godmother was a posh visitor, so stepmother couldn't really complain. They talked and talked, and the fairy godmother learned all about Cinderella's life. And she said, well, I think you need to go to this ball. Cinderella looked at her clothes and said, how can I? And it's a long walk. Leave it to me, said fairy godmother. Now, Fetch a pumpkin out of the garden and put it outside the front door. Then get a knife and spoon and scoop it all out. Well, yes, fairy godmother. She got the pumpkin, put it by the front door, scooped it out, and the fairy godmother pulled a long shining stick from her bag. It was a wand, and touched the pumpkin, and with a shimmer and a sparkle it grew and grew and grew into a great round golden coach. And then the fairy godmother said, "Now we need horses. Have you got any mice in the traps?" Cinderella went down to the kitchen, and she always used humane traps, ones that didn't kill the mice. She preferred to catch them in a box and put them a long way away. And so there were 6 fine fat mice. And she brought them up, and the fairy godmother said, "Open the trap door." And she did, and as each one came out, she touched them with their wand. And as she did, they grew and grew and grew into fine bay horses. They were a little bit mousy around their faces, and their tails were a little long and thin. But Cinderella wasn't going to mind. "Now," said the fairy godmother, "who shall we have as a coachman?" And Cinderella said, "There's a large rat that lives at the back of the kitchen." "Ah," said the fairy godmother, "a rat with a nice sleek dark coat, that would be wonderful." So Cinderella, who actually had made a bit of a pet of this rat, she went and caught him, brought him up and put him in front of the coach, and the fairy godmother touched him with her wand, and he grew into a tall, dark, handsome coachman dressed all in black velvet. He was magnificent. He bowed and stroked his whiskers and jumped up behind the horses. "Now," said the fairy godmother, "we need coachmen. Are there any lizards in the garden?" "Oh, yes," said Cinderella. "There's several down by the dustbins." She ran and got 4, and once more the fairy godmother touched them with her wand, and boom! There were 4 liveried footmen, all dressed in green and blue, the colours the lizards had been. And one opened the door for Cinderella, 2 sprang up behind, and another sat beside the coachman. Cinderella looked down and said, well, thank you, fairy godmother, but I don't have a dress to go in." "Oh, that's nothing," said the fairy godmother, and she touched Cinderella with her wand, and Cinderella felt all shivery and sparkly, and there she stood in a beautiful cloth of silver dress. It was magnificent, and lovely red garnets around her throat and earrings, and on her feet were a pair of wonderful glass slippers. "There," said fairy godmother, "I think you'll do. Now go and have fun. Oh, but one thing, you must be home before midnight, or all my magic will just disappear into nothing." "Very well," said Cinderella. "Thank you very much, fairy godmother," and she got into the coach and blew kisses and went off to the ball. Or when she arrived at the ball, it was in full swing. And as she got out of the coach with the help of her footman, she went up the steps of the palace door, and the chief butler, seeing this amazing princess coming late, ran with his guest list and said, "Madam, what is your name?" And she was about to give her true name, and she thought, no, she didn't want her sisters to know she was there. So she said, "I am Eleonora," and then she decided to use her mother's name. "I am Eleonora Dubois." Well, the butler, slightly flustered, looked down the list, and there was no Eleonora Dubois there, but obviously this was a lady of some importance who'd just got missed. And so he escorted her into the ballroom and announced, "Lady Eleonora Dubois." Suddenly the musicians stopped, and everybody stared at the beauty and magnificence of this new visitor. The prince himself stopped dancing and came forward and bowed and said, "My lady, will you dance?" And they danced and danced, and they sat next to each other when they ate. And even Cinderella's sisters sat very close to her, talking to her, exchanging pleasantries, and they didn't even recognize her. She laughed, but she almost forgot the time. If she hadn't overheard somebody saying, "Goodness me, it's almost midnight," she would have forgotten and overstayed. She got to her feet and curtsied to the prince and said, "My lord, forgive me, but I must go." She curtsied and left the room, leaving the prince behind, going, "Who is Eleanor? Where did she come from? Who is she?" Well, she got home just in time, and she stepped out of the coach just as it turned back into a pumpkin. And there was the fairy godmother saying, "Well done, Ella, well done. Now put the pumpkin away in case we need it, and put the mice and the rats and the lizards back where they belong." So Cinderella did, and she went back to her own room. Next morning, the sisters didn't wake up until almost lunchtime. And when they did, they were so full of the ball and this amazing woman who'd turned up who nobody knew who she was, and she had to be a princess, didn't she? Cinderella said nothing. She sort of smiled quietly to herself while she got on with her jobs, and after lunch she was required once more to help dress the girls for the second part of the grand ball. The girls fussed and they couldn't decide which of their spare 2 dresses to wear, but eventually they were ready. Their hair was done, their makeup was worse than ever before, and then the elder sister turned to Cinderella and said, "Wouldn't you like to come?" "Well, yes," said Cinderella, "I would, but it's probably not a good idea, is it?" "You bet your sweet life it isn't," said the oldest. "Likes of you, there. Anyway, there's the most amazing woman there, and it would be such a discourtesy to have someone like you in the same room as the Lady Eleanor Dubois. We are close bosom friends with her. We sat with her. We dined with her. She shared all sorts of confidences. We are confident we will be invited to come visiting soon." Cinderella bowed her head and could hardly stop giggling. And then, with great relief, she waved her sisters off. Once more she sat in the kitchen, and once more the fairy godmother turned up. "Would you like to go again?" "Oh, I'd love to," she said. "Same as before?" "Yes," said the fairy godmother. So very quickly Cinderella assembled the pumpkin, the mice, the rat, the lizards. The fairy godmother changed everything into the coach, the horses, the footman, and Cinderella into a magnificent gown of cloth of gold. And this time, when she got to the ball, the chief butler saw her and announced her even before she had finished getting up the stairs. The ballroom fell quiet. Everybody parted to leave a grand entrance for Eleanor. She walked across the ballroom towards the prince, who bowed and gave her his hand. And this time they danced and talked and danced and talked, and they were falling in love. And when the clock began to strike 12, Cinderella went, "Excuse me, sire," and she just ran. She ran out of the ballroom, she ran across the grand corridor and down to where her carriage had been, but that was the last stroke of 12, and the carriage before her eyes just shrunk down to a withered old pumpkin. And the mice and the rats and the lizards ran away, and Cinderella dived into a bush so no one would see her cloth of gold dress turn into rags. And she ran home, but she had to run home barefoot, because one shoe she had lost on the steps of the palace, and the other, because you can't run in one shoe off and one shoe on, she put into her pocket. The prince came out looking for her, and he asked the guards if they had seen a woman in a magnificent cloth of gold dress, and they said, "No, there was a beggar girl running about, but we shooed her away. No one here like that, sire." So the following morning, when the stepsisters condescended to wake up, they were full of the Lady Eleanor Dubois running away and the prince being distraught. And then there came a proclamation, the town crier coming down the street saying, "Oh yay, oh yay, oh yay! The prince will marry whoever foot fits this glass slipper. Oh yay, oh yay, oh yay!" Well, the girls looked at each other, and they both looked at their feet and thought, "There's a chance for us yet. He doesn't know who she is." And that day and the next week, the prince went round every household in the town, seeing whose foot would fit the glass slipper. Well, when they came round to Cinderella's house, the girls were there waiting. Their feet were washed and perfumed and oiled to make sure the slipper would slip on easily. And the prince and his footman came in. And the footman knelt before the eldest sister and tried to put the shoe on, but it was far too small. And then the second sister said, I have a much more delicate foot, and put out her foot. But it was too wide. And then Cinderella, standing behind them, smiled and said, May I try? Girls said, Oh, ignore her, she's just a serving girl. But the footman said, No, the prince has said every lady. He didn't say every lady but no servants. So Cinderella sat, presented her foot, and the shoe slipped on. And then from her pocket she drew the other shoe. And so the footman knew that this was the girl the prince had dreamed of. She was taken in a silver carriage to the palace straight away, and she told the prince and the king everything that had happened. Well, the prince and Cinderella had time to get to know each other, and they decided they had fallen in love and they would love to be married. Now you can imagine her sisters were running around and determined to ingratiate themselves, to say, Oh, you need me, can I be your lady in waiting? And Cinderella looked at them and said, Yes, I think we can find a job for you at the palace. So the girls packed all their fine things and went off in the carriage. But when they arrived at the grand front door, the butler asked their names, and when they gave them, they said, Oh yes, Princess Ella has given instructions. You are to go round to the servants' door, if you don't mind. The girls were flustered and distraught, but did as they'd been told, only to find their new jobs at the palace weren't as ladies in waiting, but scrubbing dirty pots in the scullery, which I think was about right for them, don't you?